The Nature of Globalisation. Hello again. In this short lecture, I'll introduce and explore some ideas about globalisation and what it might mean for leaders and managers of organisations operating or planning to operate in the global market. But first, ask yourself this question. What is globalisation and where did it come from? Now, at one level, you might set your answer in the context of the arrival of the term into everyday use, which would suggest globalisation is a 20th century phenomena and only came about as the result of communications links which allowed for organisations to operate in multiple and widely separated parts of the globe, connected by means of exchanging information at the speed of light. Another perspective might suggest that globalisation is nothing more than the continuation of human exploration and expansion across the surface of our planet as we've evolved to become the dominant species on Earth. It's natural that what began as exchanges of goods from distant cultures should develop a growth in demand for those same goods, which has now become an appetite of such size that organisations have evolved which control every aspect of the supply of those goods, from the extraction of raw materials to manufacturing and distribution, right up to the point of sale to customers. This is perhaps a more traditional view of globalisation, which reflects the growth of mega corporations, mostly with a point of origin in the global northwest in the mid to late 20th century. Although one might cite the example of the Dutch and British East India companies as early examples of organisations which operated in a way very much like that I've just described. A third way to reflect on the notion of globalisation might be to think about the democratisation of digital technology and information. We'll talk about technology in the fourth industrial age later in the module, but by way of introduction, it's worth thinking about what life was like before home computers were ubiquitous and before the rise of digital technology, such as smartphones. I find this latter view of globalisation to be the one that most resonates with me. I grew up in the transition between the globalised world we live in now and the time that preceded it, and I can tell you that the two periods were very different indeed. In my youth, access to information was much more limited. I learned about the world from books and the occasional television programme on one of the 3 channels which were available at the time. Neither I nor my parents had any concept of buying goods directly from a manufacturer on the other side of the world, and we certainly didn't have the sense of connectedness with a global community that my own children appear to have. We were, in some ways, safe in our largely unconnected space, protected from events that we knew nothing about. But the world has changed, and our ability to see, explore, and be present, digitally at least, beyond the local has changed with it. This has had impacts on all human activity, and for organisations which find themselves now operating in the global context, it has meant having to adapt their very existence to the world we now live in. To put this in context, there's only been one period in my life, since the mid-1980s, where I experienced something even approaching the way I spent my early years, and that was during the first COVID lockdown, when almost all of the connections and connectedness we've come to take for granted in our lives was suddenly taken away. Okay, enough history. What does globalisation mean for organisations as they seek to expand into the global marketplace? Well, initially, globalisation might have been seen in the second of the 3 ways I described a moment ago, whereby the global northwest, or what used to be described as the First World, sought to export its ideas, cultures and norms, including business practice, to developing parts of the world. This somewhat colonial view of globalising practices might have masked the need to think about cultural views and business practices other than their own for many, but it was hardly likely to last, was it? Globalisation and the concomitant pace of the exchange of ideas have led to a situation whereby global northwest business models no longer dominate, and challenges to such traditional ways of operating mount as organisations realise they have to constantly adapt to maintain their position in the marketplace. Keep this thought in mind, as it's something we'll come back to, the dichotomy of constant change also being an enabler of sustainable business when the two terms would appear to contradict each other. So let's look at some illustrative figures. These are drawn from the helpful and fascinating analysis of data provided by the Our World in Data website, which you can access directly from your device if you wish. Try entering the search term globalisation to get started. I recommend taking a look. It contains some fascinating facts, and it may be a useful source when it comes to completing assignments. In the period between the late 19th century and today, a measure of the global openness of trade shows a near 500% rise in the index, from around 10% to a figure around 60%. And that's in the context of a rise from circa 5% to circa 10% in the 400 years between 1500 and 1900. In the 1900 years leading up to the start of the 20th century, it's estimated that global GDP never exceeded $5 trillion. In the 125 years since, it soared to in excess of $140 trillion. These two facts alone illustrate the impact of globalization on trade and the global economy, and they are but a small part of the data available which reinforces this finding. The bottom line is that trade is global, and that even with the impacts of 2 world wars and more recently the COVID pandemic, it is likely to remain an engine of growth into the future. I suggest this means organisations simply must think and keep thinking about how to operate in the global market and how to adapt to a way of operating that is at the same time global, but also reflects the often different needs and demands of a whole lot of local environments. It's not enough to simply assume that the business model which works well in North America will have a similar level of success in the Far East or the Global South. In fact, one doesn't have to pick points as far apart as this to uncover cultural differences which have implications for organisations operating in the global market. Think of the initial incomprehension caused among executives used to operating according to US business practice when they discovered that not only were they discouraged from contacting their employees in France out of normal business hours, but that it was actually illegal to do so. This tiny example of cultural misalignment is but the tip of the iceberg that organisations need to be prepared to navigate over the years to come. And I haven't even started on mentioning the complexity of operating in a market which spans nations engaged in trade wars or even actual wars with each other. So to conclude, globalisation is here and is alive and well despite recent shocks. Organisations who wish to operate in the global marketplace need to be alive to the contradiction of a marketplace which is at one level more connected than ever before, and at another remains as divergent in its multiple parts as ever it did. Awareness, sensitivity, and the ability to achieve local fit while retaining global reputation and customer loyalty are just some of the things we need to think about as leaders and managers in the space. In the remaining lectures of this chapter, that is exactly what we'll go on to do, beginning with a closer look at the global megatrends which have emerged to dominate in the past few years. Thank you.